So we're going to begin our second panel, which is our opportunity again to turn to a different region within Asia and look at the ASEAN region in terms of, the bringing in perspectives again from the U.S., but as well as from those in the region, through the dialogue that we've mentioned previously with the National University of Singapore in RTU. We have Eugene from RTU with us. I've I've been introduced, so we won't redo that. And I will mention that just like in the first panel, we've got three people that will really be able to take us deeply into the issue, and we're going to use the same basic structure. What I'll do is introduce to each of the panelists as I bring them into the discussion and give them the opportunity to make their opening remarks. And we will go with Eugene Tan first, Chris Painter second, and Elina Noor third, with about 10 minutes or so of opening remarks. Hopefully, some interaction between the panelists who I know all know each other, and go to the audience from there. I may have a question or two. I think we had a good set of Q&A in the last panel, and hopefully we do the same here. So, I thought the opening panel was, very interesting and in sort of very big picture, fundamental issues of, for Japan and its national security policy, the depth and needs, the nature of the US-Japanese alliance. As we move to the ASEAN region, I think we have some of the same geopolitical challenges at play. And, we certainly, have great opportunities for collaboration, but the politics and the interests are different in this region. And I think one of the things that I really have valued about the dialogue we've stood up over the last year or so with the ASEAN region is to try to understand that nuance and difference in the perspectives of the different nations in the region, and how they handle the concerns, particularly the geopolitical concerns of, the increasing tensions between China and the United States. So I think this will be, an opportunity to get into that, subject matter in the realm of cyber and digital issues. All three speakers, as I introduce them, you'll see have deep experience to bring to bear here. So I'm going to start, Eugene, with you. Eugene's an associate research fellow at RSIS and focused on cybersecurity. He publishes on the issues of law and norms in cyberspace and has been deeply involved in the UN's deliberations, particularly the open-ended working group that is currently active. I saw him here in New York not long ago. So Eugene, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Greg. So I've just been introduced. My name is Eugene, and I'm from the Center of Excellence for National Security at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, NTU Singapore. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Greg for persisting in organizing regular dialogues with both Japan and Singapore over the past 2 years. I think I speak for all of us that we have learned a lot about our respective perspectives over the span of time, and having this outlet for timely updates and debates on contemporary issues actually helps us a lot. So today, what I've been tasked to do is talk about the role of geopolitics in cyberspace. And I will begin by saying that while geopolitics does still play a major role in how ASEAN relationships with external powers are structured, I think we should remember that ASEAN as an organization is geared towards promoting intergovernmental cooperation and facilitates economic, political, security, military, educational, and social cultural integration and development among its members. So this speaks more towards the inward-looking development of ASEAN, of an ASEAN-driven region, than dealing with external threats. So my remarks today will differ quite greatly from what we have heard from the previous panel, where defense was the focus of activity. I will focus more on the cooperation aspect of policy in ASEAN. I will offer that ASEAN member states are pragmatic over what they want, and seek partners both near and far. ASEAN member states seek to be friends with everyone while maintaining sovereignty over their affairs, and ASEAN, as a regional organization, drives discussion and cooperates widely with external partners and other intergovernmental organizations without exclusion, which means the United Nations, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Pacific Alliance, Gulf Cooperation Council, etc., are all dialogue partners on security and economic issues through ASEAN-led platforms such as ARF, the regional RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the East Asia Summit, and the Asia-Europe meeting. So cyber as a domain is no different, and I would argue that the growth of the digital economy in ASEAN is the latest in line to keep ASEAN relatable to the rest of the world. ASEAN pragmatically acknowledges that its creation of a safer and more secure cyberspace in ASEAN undergirds and enables ASEAN's ambitions on using the digital technologies as an engine of growth. So these digital ambitions are reflected in numerous initiatives in the ASEAN region, such as the ASEAN Smart Cities Network, the ASEAN Declaration on Industrial Transformation to Industry 4.0, and the ASEAN Digital Master Plan 2025. And of course, ASEAN member states are acutely aware that this would cause the creation of a greater cyber attack surface, an increasing complexity of interrelated cyber and digital issues, and the increasing sophistication of cyber attacks resulting from this increased digital interconnectedness. To combat this, ASEAN seeks to support the establishment of a rules-based multilateral order for cyberspace, one that is open, secure, stable, accessible, interoperable, and peaceful, built through the application of voluntary, non-binding norms of responsible state behavior, confidence-building measures, and coordinated capacity building by enhanced cooperation within ASEAN and with ASEAN dialogue partners. So at this point, I would like to surface the ASEAN Cybersecurity Cooperation Strategy 2021 to 2025 to highlight how ASEAN intends to do so. This strategy focuses on 5 work streams. First, to advance cyber readiness cooperation. Second, strengthen regional cyber policy coordination. Third, enhance trust in cyberspace. And fourth, regional capacity building. And fifth, and most importantly, international cooperation. These work streams collectively point towards an approach that's internally facing rather than being externally hostile, seeking to create a stronger ASEAN community through a mix of confidence building and capacity building measures. So I think it's safe to say that ASEAN as a region is still squarely focused on cyber as a growth engine rather than a domain for conflict and competition. This is also, however, not to say that states in the region are unconcerned about the risks arising from geopolitics, especially about the US-China competition and the Russian-Ukraine conflict. It is often said that when elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. And I'll leave you to think about who the elephant and who the grass is. ASEAN keenly feels the tension in US-China relations, and balancing is increasingly getting harder, especially in areas of tech. The US is an important partner to the region, but so is China. Its proximity to the region means that China is a reality that ASEAN member states have to learn how to live with, how to manage. But at the same time, Chinese domination is not something that all states in the region can live with, as seen in the development of anti-Chinese national narratives in some states like Vietnam, as a Chinese vassal, and as well as aggressive Chinese behavior in the region, as evidenced by competing claims and clashes in the South China Sea. So the name of the game in the ASEAN region is to maintain the balance of power. This is the same for Russia. While none of the states have been a vassal of Russia, there are states in the region that have maintained very close relationships with Russia, like Myanmar, especially under junta, and Vietnam. This can be best seen at the United Nations, where most ASEAN member states have condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And Singapore has joined up to sanction Russia for the egregious violation of another state's sovereignty. But most importantly to our conversation today, what I feel is Russia and China still remain dialogue partners with the ASEAN region. And this can be seen in Indonesia, where Indonesia, as G20 chair, refused to rescind the invitation to Russian President Putin to attend the G20 summit in Bali last year. Singapore, at its International Cyber Week, also invited a high-level Russian official to dialogue with other partners. ASEAN has played host to peace summits between the US and the DPRK in both Singapore and Vietnam. So diplomacy is still possible in the ASEAN region. But I would like to qualify this that if ASEAN member states dialogue with China or Russia, it does not necessarily mean ASEAN or its member states endorse their positions, but rather it's a function of ASEAN valuing the continuation of dialogue. I think we would also like our friends to be friends, but it's easier said than done. We would like, I think people in ASEAN would like to hope that people understand that what ASEAN is trying to do. ASEAN endeavors to keep all our friends at the table, even those who have erred, so that we might find a way forward to get rules of the road for multiple issues, which include cyber. So on this note, I would like to offer this view in closing, that ASEAN member states are well versed in being interlocutor when dialogue is even when dialogue is inconvenient. And the future road to progress on cyber issues may run through the ASEAN member states. To this end, ASEAN has already some institutions and mechanisms that can facilitate this discussion on top of those at the UN, such as the ASEAN Singapore Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, the UN Singapore Cyber Program, and the Singapore International Cyber Week. Excuse me. So ASEAN can provide this level of neutrality that's far from the gaze of domestic pressures to find consensus on issues with inconvenient partners. So perhaps, just perhaps, that diplomacy can be given the chance to succeed with ASEAN at the center. So with this, I'll hand it back to Craig.
Thanks a lot, Eugene. Really great set of opening remarks, covering a lot of ground. Sort of as we transition, to the next speaker, Chris, I'm probably going to ask you, Chris, to Eugene's thoughts on, ASEAN as an interlocutor, given their, sort of continued willingness to talk with all. It'd be very interesting to get your views. Chris Painter, a longtime collaborator, and I would say probably the most acknowledged U.S. leader in international engagement, giving his background. He's currently president of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise Foundation, but as probably most know, or many know, a longtime public servant in the United States, all the way back to being a cyber prosecutor in the Department of Justice, a senior director on the national security staff, and then our first cyber coordinator in the State Department, and working for Secretary Clinton, and really sort of upping our game, and the driver behind our first international cyber strategy. So Chris is certainly immensely equipped to comment on the nature of geopolitics, but also very engaged in the ASEAN region specifically. I think and very engaged in our continued going forward. And trying to, I really liked Eugene's last comment, Chris. So if you could work it into your remarks about, how we work with ASEAN on, keeping the dialogue alive globally, I think that's a crux issue. So over to you, Chris.
So thanks, Greg, and thanks, Eugene, for those opening comments, and Elina, when she speaks too, who will raise a lot of issues and is familiar with the region. Look, I'd say I largely agree with Eugene's comments. I'll expand a few things. Among other things, when I was our cyber diplomat, I started our ASEAN-US the cyber portion of the dialogue. There was already a US-ASEAN partner dialogue, as you all know. It's been long-standing. But now, many years ago, we started an ASEAN cyber dialogue, which started small, and I think it's expanded over time, as you'd expect. And one of the things I think is critical to think about ASEAN is there is a huge diversity of countries within that grouping. So it is not like a like-minded alliance of any kind. They have different views within, even domestically, on regulatory issues, on foreign policy issues, even related to cyber. So it's not, you can't think of ASEAN as a block. You can't think of it as a voting block. You can't think of it as, it's not like the European Union or something like that. It's very different as an organization. As Eugene said, I think it's focused more internally on things to help ASEAN grow as a whole, recognizing the difference of the members in ASEAN, and trying to bring them up to the same speed. And that's where we'll get into some capacity building efforts, because there is a pretty big disparity in terms of cyber capability and protection that I think Singapore and others have been trying to address through a number of initiatives, and the US too. So I think that's been critical too. So I would note on that US-ASEAN cyber dialogue that started a number of years ago, they just had the third official one. Now, there's been more than three, but the third kind of official one happened just in February of this last year. And if you look at, which is easily available, the kind of chair statement of the US ASEAN cyber dialogue, nothing really shocking or surprising there. I mean, the focus, I think, as Eugene said, I think there's great interest, and we hear this from Singapore all the time, and from David Koh from Singapore, of countries in the region, because they're smaller countries, because they're not the big elephants, really, really care about the rules-based order in cyberspace, because if that rules-based order doesn't exist, they're the ones that suffer the most. They don't have the capabilities, the power to necessarily protect themselves, although they're trying to develop them. So the rules-based order is critical to their survival, is the way they look at it. And so I think that's important as we get in some of the geopolitical discussions. But if you look at the statement, as I said, nothing really surprising. I think that the key elements of the statement from this last dialogue were similar to some of the things we talked about in the beginning. The difference being, it talks about a number of dialogues in cybercrime and cybersecurity between the US and ASEAN that now exists, that didn't really exist before, which I think is important. And this is an ongoing dialogue, and I think that's important too. This is not just a one-off. They're trying to set the fourth one, as the statement says, hopefully alongside of Singapore Cyber Week in October of this year. So that ongoing dialogue with ASEAN, I think, is an important connector. Now, as Eugene says, ASEAN also has dialogues with other partners that maybe the US doesn't view that favorably, like Russia or China, for instance. So, this is not exclusive, but at the same time, my sense is, of those partner dialogues, this is the most mature in terms of discussions, which I think is important. So when you look at that, I think some of the main takeaways from that statement are things like capacity building. This goes to Eugene's point of making sure that ASEAN countries have the growth capability. And so the capacity building is both in terms of cyber, but also digital connectivity. And that's where I think, in terms of practical aspects, there's the most common ground, things that the countries can do together. There is a discussion of norms and the importance of the rules-based order. I'd say that ASEAN has, in some ways, as a region, led in that area. ASEAN was the first group and the digital and the ministerial level to endorse the UN norms as a region, which I think was a Singaporean initiative, but a really important one. So they, as I said, they do believe in the rules-based order. And they believe in confidence building measures, and that was mentioned, that triad of and smart capacity building. I think that the difficulty here is when you get to the next level that was discussed in the last panel of, like, okay, rules-based order is great, Norms are great. What happens when people violate them, like we've seen, for instance, with Russia recently? That accountability piece, I don't really think ASEAN is going to be the group that's going to enforce accountability, either through joint attribution or taking action. Now, individual member states within ASEAN will, I think, and I think it's, as Eugene pointed out, a number of ASEAN countries publicly condemned, for instance, Russia's actions in Ukraine. That was a pretty big thing for ASEAN because, as Eugene said, they try to be everyone's friend, which understandably that's true. So it's a pretty big step to say no, that's not permissible. And the reason I think that happened was frankly because of this rules-based order and the small state dynamic, that if countries can willy-nilly violate that rules-based order, that threatens ASEAN countries. So that's why a number of them, sometimes the first time, came out and condemned Russia for that action. So I think that was important. But again, not as a block, right? The other, but they do care about, making further progress on the norms, on confidence building measures and articulating them. I think there's a lot of interest within the ASEAN countries to do that, but I don't think they're going to be the collective action vehicle to do something against it. Again, individuals will, and I think that's important. In terms of the capacity building issues, I'd say that has been another bright spot in ASEAN. There's the ASEAN Singapore Cyber Center. There's been a lot of demand from within ASEAN countries. I mean, there's been major attacks within ASEAN. You remember a number of years ago where the Vietnam airport had a cyber attack, and that kind of woke people up. And so we've seen that throughout ASEAN. Singapore itself, I always say, went from 0 to 60, within a very short time almost 10 years ago. But that was 8 years ago, but that was pretty impressive. And I think has led the efforts for a lot of the countries. And of course, the ASEAN countries look at the region, they look at the threats of the region. And, I agree on a geopolitical level, ASEAN doesn't want to get involved in those disputes. Individual countries will to some extent, but there is recognition that what Russia is doing in the Ukraine, despite close ties, is something that's threatening. It's not in their backyard, but it's something that's threatening. I'd make one point about that often I read that from commentators, that Russia has not done a great job in terms of diplomacy and in terms of disinformation in Europe, and trying to shape the narrative of what's happening in the Ukraine. But don't write off Russia's activity in other parts of the world, including in the ASEAN region, where I think they're very active in trying to do that, and maybe having more success than they are in Europe for various reasons. So I think that's a challenge, right? That I think they have a little more success there in terms of how this is playing out. China is, as Eugene said, is a much harder nut to crack in this, because there's a lot of dependency on China. China is a major player in the region. All these countries have close relations with China to some degree, but not just in cyber, but geopolitically, they're worried about some of China's actions. As China becomes more aggressive, that affects ASEAN. And I think Eugene laid that down very well in terms of what's going on. And does that mean you'd expect, again, a unified front against China on particular issues? Probably not. But will you see these countries being sensitive to it and trying to figure out what to do about it? Yes, absolutely. I think that I think the days are gone where it's like, okay, we'll accept what China is going to do, to being skeptical and also trying to figure out what's best for ASEAN countries. This all goes back to what Eugene said about ASEAN's really being focused in its future development internally and how they can partner with everyone to make that good. And if there's a threat to that, that's a problem for them. I think probably that, as I said, on the cyber conflict front, I think that I don't expect countries to, as a block, kind of condemn China for actions, but individual ones might, depending on what those actions are. On the technology front, that's a lot harder because the 5G debate and other debates, I think a lot of these countries are torn. They do care about their own security, but at the same time, they want their economic growth, and they don't want to alienate their partners either. So I think that's a harder thing to look at. So from the U.S. perspective, just to kind of close this out, I know we'll have the fireside chat, and I want to echo a lot of the points that Admiral Blair made too, that, you look at the strategy, there is a pillar in the strategy on international cooperation and capacity building, et cetera. And they don't mention, as I recall, ASEAN by name as an organization, but they don't mention a lot of organizations by name, so I don't think that matters. And by the way, I think as many people know, there is a follow-up State Department strategy that's been mandated by Congress, which I think will get more into the weeds on individual organizations and other things, and be more expansive. The international portion of the national strategy, I say is good, but was, I think, a statement of where the U.S. has been a little bit and a little bit more forward-leaning. I think you'll see more articulation in the state strategy. However, again, that U.S. strategy talked about capacity building, talked about working with partners, helping partners with their own resiliency. I think all those things apply to the ASEAN region as a group. I think the parts of the strategy that talked about bringing costs on bad actors, I think, as I said earlier, that's a harder thing. So, look, I don't expect this to change. I expect that the U.S. will continue to work closely with ASEAN, that the U.S. wants to work closely with ASEAN. They recognize the value of that. But they will also work with individual ASEAN countries where maybe they can make further grounds on some of these other particular geopolitical issues, and that's to be expected, and that's not a bad thing. So I'll stop with that.
Thanks much, Chris. As we sort of go deeper, into this, it's now Elina's chance to speak, and she also brings a lot of background in sort of analyzing these issues, but also participating in things like, the norms creation and, the notion of a rules-based order. Elina is the senior fellow at the Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, focused on the issues of technology and cyber, deep experience in the, think tank world, including at the Asia Society's Policy Institute and the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, and served on the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace. Elina, again, if you, as you react to both, Eugene and Chris, and with your own remarks, I just highlight the notion that while we use the word ASEAN and we focused on it as an organization, certainly, the aperture here is the individual, and we've already talked about it, differences in national concerns within the region. So over to you, and then I would encourage the audience as a whole to begin to think about putting questions in the Q&A or the chat, and we will move on to that after Elina's remarks. So Elina, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Greg, for giving me this opportunity to share the screen with to friends and colleagues, Eugene and Chris. Honestly, not very much I can disagree with. In fact, I would violently agree with most of what they've said, if not everything that they've said. But maybe I can offer 3 brief points from slightly different angles. And I think for me to react to what they said is not very much by way of differentiation. But having listened to the first panel, I could not think of a starker difference in focus between what happened in the first panel and what we're discussing now. And I think that speaks volumes about the focus in Southeast Asia or in the ASEAN region, and where the priorities for the region lie. So I think a good, by way of my first point, a good preview of what the region is really thinking about is in the ASEAN Cybersecurity Strategy, which dates from 2021 to 2025, if I'm not mistaken. I think Eugene might have mentioned that strategy. But if you look at the very first sentence, the opening sentence of that strategy, it talks about cybersecurity being a key enabler of the digital economy, in essence. I'm paraphrasing, but really the focus of that strategy is on the digital economy and economic progress. And that really encapsulates what the region is thinking about when it talks about cybersecurity and resilience in cyberspace. There's not very much by way of defending itself in cyberspace against state actors. And really the main agenda for ASEAN is in enabling cyberspace to be a domain for economic progress, not really any discussion about peace and security. And so I think this focus on enabling growth and digital progress and digital economy is key for its own reasons. And obviously, apart from economic growth, there are also developmental priorities that the region has when it comes to cyberspace. But by way of my second point, there's a bit of a dissonance here between what the region is willing to discuss and what is really taking place on the ground. And in fact, these conversations about the realities on the ground are not had very much in the public space, at least. I'm referring here to a number of intrusions that have taken place vis-a-vis the South China Sea dispute. So we're talking about geopolitical realities in today's discussion. And some of the contestation that's taken place in the maritime domain has also been reflected in cyberspace in Southeast Asia. There have been reports of advanced persistent threats, APTs, taking place for at least 2 decades, if not longer, in Southeast Asia, targeting both public and private sectors, including law firms that were involved in the 2016 arbitration case between the Philippines and China. And I think this dissonance between what the region is willing to discuss and what is happening on the ground is also reflective of ASEAN's hesitancy in getting itself entangled in these very types of geopolitical tensions. It recognizes this reality, but at the same time, it's not really forward-leaning on what it can or what it should or shouldn't do. And this kind of leads me to my third point about some of the interesting developments that are taking place that will potentially impact Southeast Asia's choices, whether individually or collectively as a grouping within ASEAN. And here I want to tie it back to what was discussed in the first panel. I think with national security strategies or policies that are taking a sharper tone against China or even Russia, Southeast Asia's familiar refrain of not wanting to choose is going to be heard more and more, but it's also going to be more difficult for Southeast Asian countries to not have to choose. And that space for them to maneuver and navigate between these geopolitical tensions is going to be even narrower when there are countries that are dialogue partners to ASEAN, but there are also allies to the US that are going to take a sharper tone in their direction when it comes to national security strategies or otherwise. And I think this will bear out when it comes to the specificities of norms and international law. So for example, this concept of active defense or persistent engagement or whatever the phrase of the day might be, these types of operations done in the name of actively defending against cyber threats, if they're going to be rooted through third countries in Southeast Asia, then Southeast Asian governments will have, and private sector companies will have very stark decisions to make. And that is whether they will enable or allow themselves to be embroiled in these types of operations, whether they will allow themselves to be publicly accountable to their own domestic constituencies if they do so, and whether they will themselves take on a more active role in active defense or persistently engaging with adversarial actors in cyberspace. And these types of discussions are not being had at the ministerial level in a number of the cyberspace forums that are taking place right now in the region. And so it goes back to my point about this dissonance between rhetoric and reality. And I'm not sure how long Southeast Asian governments can keep up this charade. But as Chris mentioned, there are steps to try to concretize some of these international legal concepts. They're not moving at a fast enough pace, in my personal view, but at least there is some initial discussion going on within some Southeast Asian countries, not all, about what certain international legal notions should look like and how they should be fleshed out. So I'll just pause here and look forward to the discussion.